Yeah, I did. Just for a while.
Can you bring it back?
Oh, it's on its own.
You good? You good? Okay. Can folks hear me? Okay. We're good. All right, so well, I don't know if I'm violating every protocol in human history, but what I wanted to do more so than kind of a breakout presentation, you know, all of these days just kind of run in, and this is, I guess they're prepping you all for the madness of professional developments. So sometimes institute days at schoolhouses are just a whole different thing, and you're trying to get stuff done for class, like grade papers, which I've been doing while I've been here. But what I wanted to do was just really kind of open it up and have more of a conversation about some stuff that you all are seeing, stuff that you all are experiencing, things that you all may have questions about, because it's really around, you know, when you get into teaching, the exchange of what it is that you're doing becomes really important, right? Because you might be operating in a unit, you might be operating in a grade team, you might be operating in a number of different capacities, but that grouping of people are the folks that you share resources with. Those are the folks that you interact with. Those are the folks who may have some institutional knowledge about the place that you're in. So those are useful spaces or not, right? Because it's really your lens of criticality is deeply important. So you have to be clear about what is useful and what is not, right? And then being able to utilize what's useful and then exchange with folks based on how you understand that utility, right? So, and I apologize if anybody was thrown off by my presentation style. You know, a lot of times, you know, people expect professional developments to be very straight-laced, and I am deeply my mother's child in that way. We're both Geminis. My birthday is the 19th. Her birthday is the 20th. So we have that thing around being excitable, shall we say, right? But yeah, I just wanted to open it up for questions that folks may have about some things that you all are thinking about, or some things that you all are seeing or are concerned about, right? Because, you know, this thing around you all in a teacher prep program, in so many instances, we don't do right by y'all. So it's really important to be very intentional, I think, on my end, to have that space where we can actually do right by folks by engaging them with real concerns and issues. So we can open it up. I promise nobody will be in trouble. Oh, and yeah, we got the mic going on. I guess this is live streaming while I got my little Janet Jackson apparatus on. You know.
It's a vibe, really.
At least it's just that one.
Yeah, exactly. For real, like, for real.
Yeah, so I had a question, mainly because something that I'm really concerned about is like the school to prison pipeline. And something that you said that stuck with me is like how education like happens in spite of schooling. So like I don't really want to be a teacher who's like sit down, be silent, take notes, like fall in line kind of thing. But also I don't want like my other students to like get the short end of the stick if another kid is like distracting or is like,
Right.
So I don't know how to, one thing I really want to like focus on is how to make my classroom like not be that type of class where like kids aren't allowed to talk or are afraid to like stand up or something like that. But I also want to make sure that like learning takes place.
Yep, and what you are really talking about, and thank you for this question, because there's a couple of things that I'm hearing. One of the things, so for 18 years I was in a college of education, and now I'm in a college of liberal arts and sciences. and I'm actually in a criminology law and justice department. And one of the things that becomes important is how we understand what is referred to as a carceral logic, right? And carceral just means anything that has to do with prisons. And when we think about schools and its relationship to prisons, I actually think we're dealing with something a little more intense, right? And I give you all an example of this. I'm doing all the opposite stuff and terrible stuff that they tell us not to do, right? Start writing and talking, right? But we actually have to think about this as a nexus. Oh, thank you so much. And this nexus is really around, this is the place where the logic of the school and the logic of the prison meet. And when we talk about the pipeline, we often think about a place that is preparing young folks for prison. But actually the logics tell us something very different. And let's just think about the way the school is shaped, right? When folks come in, they go through a metal detector. Many folks wear uniforms. Many schools have this line down the middle of the hallway, please step to the right, right? We've seen all of this, right? Some folks have rules where folks have to walk in the hallways with their hands behind their back, hands crossed. We've all seen silent lunches. The most horrific way to torture a young person is to give them a silent lunch, right? I mean, like that is like lo-fi torture, right? So over the last 6 years, I've been teaching in a prison. The exact same things that I described to you in terms of the physical descriptions of the space is exactly what the prison looks like. Same uniform, same metal detector, same sign, please step to the right, same kind of rules. So now, when we think about what is the interruption of that nexus, one of the things in our classroom is to engage a space of saying, no one is in trouble for asking a question or taking care of themselves. And I actually learned that from a kindergarten teacher, right? So if folks need to stand up and stretch, stand up and stretch. If folks need to move a little bit, all to the good. Actually incorporate movement in your class, right? So now if you got folks like, and the strategies around bringing us harmony, we often think about as simplistic, but they're deeply necessary, right? So think about if you played music. Think about if you actually had a space where you set aside time for folks to actually check in with you, right? So this thing around really being intentional about what is it that we're trying to do in relationship to learning, and then also what are folks willing, what are we now thinking about as an interruption to that particular logic, right? Because that logic is the one that gets us in the most, and when we see it enough, we start to forget it, right? We don't take into account how it shows up in all these spaces. One of the most chilling things that I've seen is that, and some of y'all may have seen this in schools, where if you're in a middle school or what have you, in the in-between periods, or when folks are in class, that they might lock the bathrooms, right? Now, and to get into a bathroom, you gotta have somebody walk you to the bathroom. The only other place that I know that happens is death row. So I'm thinking about that logic now has us think about what are we really in, right? And what are we asking young folks to do? Because most of it is about just surviving the encounter in opposed to engaging a space where we learn. So now, always think about that interruption, right? So music is an interruption to this kind of didactic behavior, right? Having a conversation about folks taking care of themselves is absent of the conversation of sit down, be quiet, line up, right? Another thing that will be important, because you're also developing relationships with folks, you now have to be honest around when you are upset and when you are deeply proud of them. Because now what we're talking about is how we demonstrate love in those spaces, right? And I think that's really, it sounds basic in some ways, but I think those types of reminders allow us to now go into what we envision education to be, because we got tangible examples of how to do it, right? But I think those little things, so when you talk about interrupting that nexus, think about those little things that you can do in your practice, right? And checking in with young folks, right? Okay, when we did this, y'all, did this work, right? When we did this work, right? What can we possibly do to improve, right? Because it's the thing is, and you saying, I'm learning too, right? So this thing around young folks appreciate that honesty, right? Because they're in a space where so many folks are not honest with them, right? So I think it's really important to kind of put that in a space where we can now think about very intentional interruptions, however small, right? But thank you for that, because we don't see it in terms of the day-to-day functions of a place, in opposed to how we can now interrupt it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I come from the land of pre-K, so early childhood, and we are really focused on social emotional learning. So do you think, and picking up that you're more high school, middle school, do you think that you can still incorporate social emotional learning at the high school, because they need to be able to have those disagreements, have those conversations, and process somebody else's feelings and incorporate it?
Right. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. And the thing around, it's really around us trusting young people, right? So how do we engage a practice that demonstrates trust, right? So now especially if you got pre-K, having folks articulate how they feel, right? Now, there's an important piece to this, especially with little ones, how you follow up with them, right? So if they talk about how it is that they're feeling, what have you, and then you go back, remember when we talked about yesterday how you feeling like this? Now, how are you feeling now? Is it a little different, or is it the same? Or how do you think? Do you think what I was doing, was it good? Did it not work? How are you feeling now, and why, right? Because a lot of times, we just do the order and compliance thing with little ones, right? So now the way to get out of that order and compliance is to have that interaction, to have that space where you're now able to have a different set of conversations with them, right? And trusting them to have that conversation, right? I think it's really important in the pre-K spaces, because you can do another thing that the SEL stuff doesn't really talk about as much, but what we also see is young people participating in collective activities as being important, right? Young folks have a greater propensity to share before they separate, right? So when young folks get older, and we condition this, right? We condition this through testing, right? So when young people get to third grade, think about how they're seated. Think about how young people are situated and seated in pre-K, and think about how young people are situated and seated in third grade, right? What are you introduced to for the first time between probably second to fourth grade? Rows, right? And those rows are actually reflective of another thing, right? You got to look at a cat named Philip Lancaster, right? So Lancaster wanted every school to be reflective of the work that young folks were going to enter in factories, right? That's how you get lunch lines. That's how you get school bells. That's how you get those roles. And remember, you can actually the school that I went to still had the rivets in the floor for when the desks were actually stapled and screwed into the floor, right? So this thing around, you're talking about moving chairs. I'm like, nah, homie, this is what it is, right? And now when you start to think about how are we demonstrating collective activity? What do we do to now have folks do things where they're sharing, where they're moving together, where they are now thinking about what does it mean to feel good, and if you do not feel good, now what can we do to address it? I think a lot of the social emotional learning stuff gets us into keying into folks' feelings, but it doesn't necessarily get us into how do we engage that follow-up, right? In terms of making sure that we're checking in with folks, right? Because when you check in with a young person, it's a reminder that you're not ignoring them, right? That you take them seriously. So this thing around really thinking about that, because a lot of the stuff, I think one of the major issues with schooling is that a lot of the work we do, early childhood, K through 3, we forget once they start being tested, right? And I think that's really an important conjuncture, right? Because we have to have those things. The interruption is going to happen when we decide to do things differently, right? So when I was talking to you all in the big group, don't think about doing things differently as you coming in the schoolhouse with a hatchet in the main office, just hitting the desk and be like, look, we done with this. That's not it, right? The thing is really saying, what are the practices that affirm my students, right? How do I engage in a practice that is affirming of them, right? And if there are any issues, what do I do to address them first and not from a place of punishment and containment, right? So this thing around really being intentional about that. The intentionality is the interruption, because the thing that they hope you will do is ignore what's actually happening and just kind of do your thing as you see fit, in opposed to saying, no, there's an issue here. And if we pay attention to this issue, we're all the better in our classrooms, right? And that, a lot of times when people talk to me, they always think about, well, Stovall, this is more this social justice stuff. It's like, look, man, we are talking about a space where young folks are dehumanized and not experiencing any modicum of justice. So now, in our practice, how do we begin to do that, right? And I think for everybody, because again, with pre-K, learning those lessons and keeping those lessons in the front, and this is for everybody, an important strategy. When you all get to your respective buildings, there's somebody in that space that knows what they're doing. You gotta find them, right? That is the first job, because now, and it doesn't matter what subject they teach, it doesn't matter what they do in that building. It's really around you becoming abreast to that function of that space, and now what you can do to move in it as a very knowing and critical person, right? Because in your first 3 years of teaching, you're just trying to figure it out, right? You're trying to get your footing. So now it's really around who are the folks who assist you in getting that footing, right? It really becomes important, because that, once you get your footing, there's more ease in the classroom space, right? Because now you're clear about what it is that you can do, and you can move a little differently. But thank you for that, because we have to, those are the things that we got to grapple with a little more, right? In opposed to just kind of letting them pass. Mm-hmm.
Hi, you have been giving examples with a lot of like names and history about things that I don't really know, or a lot of people probably don't know, and I want to like have like a section in my class of library books and stuff that my kids can take that are about history and like other races and authors and things that aren't just in the curriculum but could go along with it. And I also want to be knowledgeable about that as well. So are there any books that you would recommend or anything that you would recommend me looking into that would be helpful for that?
Definitely, thank you for that. There is an organization that actually specializes K through 12 in terms of making accessible material about socio-political concerns, history, and making sure that folks get what it is that they need. They're called Rethinking Schools. And for everybody, remember your teacher pass, right? All you got to do with a lot of these folks is call and say you are teaching in a classroom. You either will get hella discounts or it will be free, right? Because they really want to get stuff out to folks. So Rethinking Schools is an excellent place to get this type of material. Another piece is a book that just came out called Wake. It's a graphic novel about a rebellion of enslaved people. And the author wrote it specifically for middle schoolers. Because what she was going with, we always teach enslavement as the degradation, but we never teach the resistance. And she wrote that piece particularly for that purpose. Another piece that's a good resource is it's a spot called Rethinking Schools. There's another space called Teaching for Change, and they have a bunch of resources for folks. Another spot is the Metropolitan Center for Education at New York University. They have cataloged all of these resources for teachers K-8 around critical issues, around history, around pedagogical approaches. So they've been deeply intentional about that. Another grouping of folks that are coming out with some good stuff for teachers is this group of folks out of the University of San Francisco. And they have a program, called See Her, and C is literally letter C, H-E-R. And it's talking about all of these this particular work of women of color who have been doing school-based work. And then there is a woman by the name of Colette Anderson. She's also at the University of San Francisco, and she's been doing work around with See Her, but also another organization that is looking at shifting professional developments that are relevant to teachers to do different types of work. And I think if you look at the Rethinking Schools stuff, the Teaching for Change stuff, when you look at their references, go into those pieces too, because again, what you're trying to do is branch out. And in creating your library, which is an excellent idea, especially if you have your own classroom, getting a library up is good. Now, here's the other piece, and I'm so happy you asked this question. Whatever you get, you gotta read too, right? Because that's the thing, because that's where you build out the practice, right? Because now it's more things, and it's opening you up, right? In terms of now seeing what's possible. Another thing is to potentially team up with a librarian, right? And just kind of ask, here are my students, I want to get some stuff on this, and then just kind of going through those things, because what librarians have is just access to those databases that just open up everything, right? And then librarians are usually really friendly. They'll show you how to use it too. So those are some ways to kind of deepen your space. But a library is always a good thing, right? And it's out of Philly, there was a group of women in the 70s who called their library They called it the Black Women's People's Library. And it was literally just books set up in a neighborhood that folks could exchange, get, use, bring more books to the space. So that's a really important piece. But your curation of the books are really important, right? Because if you want folks to get a sense of themselves, be reflected in the books, you now have to get them in a space where those books actually reflect your students, right? Which is the different, it's wrong to call it extra work, right? It's just different work, right? In terms of getting young folks things that are reflective of them. And those spaces, those resources really become important. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
I didn't get one of the sources. You said Metropolitan.
Yep, the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education at New York University. The short name for it is the Metro Center. So if you Google Metro Center NYU, their stuff will show up. They have one of the best guides on critical race theory for folks in K-8. Yeah, so they've really been intentional about that. So a good grouping of people around this. Oh, and let me not forget the Howard Zinn Education Project. Because what they've done is like really compiled a lot of stuff historically to look at. And Zinn is spelled Z-I-N-N. But yeah, they've really been in the fight and have been rallying around teachers who have been wrongly fired for just teaching historical accuracy. But they have a lot of free resources for teachers. So whatever, as you all start to do your work, you want to go someplace, field trip, have somebody talk, all you got to say is, I'm a teacher. It's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen, right? So that thing around really being able to secure those resources, because folks in their heart of hearts want to contribute. They don't necessarily know what they're contributing to, but that's a good thing, right? Especially when you're trying to get different sets of resources. But they're telling me, y'all, that's our time. But I'm here throughout the day, so if questions percolate up or what have you, just pull me to the side or what have you. We can go from there. But thank y'all.